The bank manager set down his pen and looked across the desk like he was delivering a verdict, not a conversation. It was December 1984, the kind of cold that gets into the walls of old buildings and stays there. Dale Critton had driven 40 minutes on icy roads to sit in that chair, and the manager, a man named Fowler, maybe 45, wore a tie even in a town of 800 people, told him that the operating loan renewal was frozen. Not reduced. Frozen. Pending reassessment of collateral value. Dale knew what that meant. The bank wasn't worried about the collateral. The bank was worried about every farmer in the county at the same time, which meant they were worried about none of them specifically. Just protecting the ledger. He drove home without stopping for coffee. Here's what you need to understand about 1984 if you didn't live through it. Interest rates had peaked at 21% a couple years earlier and hadn't come down enough to matter. Land prices had been falling for 3 years straight. A lot of farmers who'd borrowed in the late 70s to buy land at peak prices were now holding notes worth more than the ground itself. The debt wasn't the problem that had snuck up on them. The debt was the plan. The extension agents, the bankers, the farm magazines had all said the same thing. Get big or get out. Borrow to expand. Leverage the land equity. Grow your way out of low margins. It worked until it didn't. Dale farmed 480 acres in eastern Nebraska, corn and soybeans, no livestock. His operation wasn't big by the standards people had been chasing. He hadn't borrowed to expand. He had one mortgage, a reasonable equipment note, and a seasonal operating line he'd used every year to cover seed and chemicals until grain checks came in fall. For 15 years, that cycle had worked fine. But this year, the bank was reassessing, and Dale was about to find out that a frozen operating loan isn't just a cash problem, it's a timing problem, and in farming, timing is everything. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the elevator. The Henley Cooperative Grain in Dale's County had been the primary delivery point for everything within 30 miles. In November, 2 weeks before Dale's bank meeting, Henley Coop had announced it was suspending operations pending a financial review. Pending review was banker language for probably not coming back. The next closest elevator was 62 miles west in Ord. There was another option 48 miles east, but those roads got bad in winter and stayed bad. Do the math on what that means. Dale was hauling 1,000-bushel load in his semi. 62 miles each way is 124 miles per trip. At that point in the mid-'80s, diesel was running around $1 a gallon, and a loaded semi was burning 7-8 miles to the gallon. Add in time, wear, and the opportunity cost of a driver stuck behind a wheel instead of doing other work. His per-bushel hauling cost had just more than tripled overnight. His corn that year was averaging $2.60 per bushel. His cost of production, before hauling, was around $2. 20. That 40-cent margin was already thin enough to see through. Now, he was adding 18 cents per bushel in logistics costs he'd never budgeted for. He wasn't going to break even. He was going to lose money on every bushel he moved, and he had 60,000 bushels still in the bins. What would you have done? Would you have gone back to the bank and asked for more money to cover the loss? A lot of farmers did exactly that. Added operational debt on top of expansion debt and watched the hole get deeper. Or would you have cut somewhere? Found a way to reduce the cost that was killing you? Dale Critton decided to cut. He spent 3 days going through every number he had, and what he came back to over and over was the hauling cost. That was the variable he could actually affect. He couldn't change the corn price, couldn't change the bank's mood, couldn't make the co-op reopen. But the cost of moving grain from his bins to the elevator was a number built out of smaller numbers, and one of those numbers had a vulnerability. The semi he was using was hired. A neighbor ran a trucking operation on the side, and Dale had been using him for years. Convenient, reliable, and at commercial rates. The neighbor charged by the bushel mile, which was fair when the elevator was 12 miles away. At 62 miles, it was a different equation entirely. Dale had a truck. Well, he had something that used to be a truck. It was a 1963 Chevy C60 grain truck that had been sitting behind his machine shed since he bought the place. Straight six engine, 10-foot steel box, hydraulic hoist that had seized up sometime in the late 70s. Previous owner had used it until it wasn't worth fixing, then left it as part of the sale. Dale had ignored it for years. It wasn't worth anything. The tires were cracked, two of them flat. The box had rust along the bottom rail, and nobody would buy it if he tried to sell it because nobody needed a 63 C60 with a seized hoist. Nobody wanted it. That was the point. His wife Linda saw him walking around it that Thursday evening with a flashlight, and she came out to the shed door and watched him for a while. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She already knew. She went back inside and came back with a cup of coffee and set it on the fender. "How bad is it?" she said. "Not as bad as the alternative," Dale said. The neighbor who hauled for him, a man named Gene Portis, decent guy, not a villain in this story, just a businessman, heard about Dale's plan inside of a week. Small towns. Gene told Dale straight out that fixing that truck was a waste of money, that it would cost more to repair than it was worth, that a man his age had no business learning to be a diesel mechanic, and that the smart move was to store the grain and wait for the market to improve. Gene wasn't wrong about any of that, strictly speaking. He just wasn't asking the right question. The question wasn't whether the truck was worth fixing in the abstract. The question was whether the cost of fixing it was less than the cost of not fixing it over the next 6 months. Dale had already run that number. He figured the truck needed $500 in parts minimum: hoist seals, tires, belts, a fuel pump, brake work. Maybe $700 if he hit surprises. His neighbor would charge him roughly 18 cents per bushel mile. 62 miles times 18 cents times 60,000 bushels worked out to around $670 per trip, times maybe 30 trips to move his crop. Gene would cost him $20,000 to haul his grain. The truck, if it ran, would cost him diesel and time. He called his brother-in-law in Kearney, who knew engines. They started on a Saturday in January. Here's where the story almost ended before it started. The hoist wasn't just seized. One of the hydraulic lines had cracked internally and pushed fluid into a place it wasn't supposed to be. Getting the right seals in January 1985 meant a parts run to Grand Island because nobody local stocked components for a 22-year-old truck. The fuel pump was worse than Dale thought, and while they had the front end open, they found the water pump was cracked and would have blown within a week of running. So the $700 estimate became $1,140 by the time they were done. Dale charged it to his farm account, the one Fowler at the bank was watching. The first haul almost didn't happen at all. It was the second week of February, 23 degrees, and the truck hadn't run in years. When they got it started, it ran rough for 20 minutes before it smoothed out. Dale loaded it. Careful, not to the full limit. Maybe 800 bushels instead of the 1,000 the box could theoretically hold, because he didn't fully trust the hoist yet. He pulled onto the highway at 5:45 in the morning because he wanted to be at the elevator in Ord when it opened and not be stuck in whatever line formed later in the day. 40 miles out, the temperature gauge moved. He pulled over on the shoulder of a 2-lane highway in the dark, got out, stood in the cold, and looked at the engine. The new water pump was fine. The thermostat was sticking. A $13 part that he hadn't thought to replace because it had shown no symptoms. He sat there for 25 minutes while the engine cooled, trying to decide if he should drive on slowly or call his brother-in-law to come out with a trailer. He drove on slowly, watched the gauge the whole way. Made it to Ord. When he came back that afternoon, the first thing he did was stop at the parts store and buy 2 thermostats. The second haul went without problems. The third was in a light snowstorm and took an extra 40 minutes. By the 4th and 5th trips, Dale had the routine down. He knew where the road got rough east of Spalding, knew how the truck handled with a full load on a slight grade, knew to let the engine warm up a full 15 minutes before pulling onto the highway in cold weather. By March, he'd moved 20,000 bushels under his own power. The math had shifted. His cost per bushel to haul was running about 4 cents. Diesel, his own time, routine maintenance. Gene Portis would have charged him 18 cents. On 20,000 bushels, over 62 miles, Dale was saving somewhere around $8,500. His neighbor stopped by one afternoon in March. Gene Portis, who told him fixing the truck was a waste of money. Gene leaned against his pickup and watched Dale grease the hoist fittings and said, "Getting your money's worth out of that old thing?" "Enough," Dale said. "Still say you'd have been better off just waiting for prices to improve." Dale didn't answer that. Gene drove off. But here's what Gene was really saying, without knowing it. He was articulating the dominant philosophy of that era in farming. Wait. Be patient. The market will fix it. What that philosophy ignored was that you couldn't wait indefinitely when you had a bank loan accruing interest and bins full of corn losing dry matter every month. Waiting was a strategy that required capital. Dale didn't have capital. He had grain and a working truck. Control your logistics or someone else will price them for you. That's not a philosophical point. It's arithmetic. April came. Dale had moved his corn. He'd sold it at $2. 58 average, not great, but done. He'd cleared $38 per acre after all costs, including the truck repair. Thin, but positive. The operating loan, when he went back to Fowler's office with his numbers, showed a farm that had stayed cash positive through the worst logistics crisis in the county in 20 years. Fowler looked at the numbers for a long time. "You hauled all of this yourself," he said. 62 miles each way, Dale said. 31 trips. Fowler didn't say anything for a moment. Then he renewed the operating loan. But that wasn't the end of it. That was just the beginning of the real story, summer 1985. Dale planted his corn and beans. He kept using the truck through planting season, hauling seed from the dealer rather than paying for delivery. Small savings, but it added up. He had a truck now. It was paid for. He had to decide how to use it. 3 miles east, a farmer named Harold Buss had borrowed heavily to expand in the late 70s. Harold was a good farmer. Not careless, not reckless, just operating on the theory everyone had been selling. Harold's operating loan hadn't been renewed, not restructured, not frozen, denied. Harold was hauling with Gene Portis and losing money on every load. By July, Harold was talking to an attorney about his options. There weren't many. Dale knew Harold. Not close friends, but neighbors. He drove over one evening and made him a proposition. Dale would haul Harold's grain at 10 cents per bushel, half of what Gene charged. Harold would get a better rate, Dale would get revenue from an asset that would otherwise sit idle between his own hauls. They shook on it. That fall, Dale hauled Harold's beans at 10 cents per bushel, then his corn. It wasn't a lot of money in absolute terms, but it was cash flow, actual incoming money during a season when most farms were only seeing outflows. And it changed something in how Dale thought about the truck. It wasn't just a cost reduction tool. It was an asset that could generate income. Would you have seen it that way? Or would you have kept it as a utility piece and moved on? The winter of 1985 into 1986 was when the county really started coming apart. Land prices kept falling. The Farm Home Administration was overwhelmed with restructuring requests. Banks that had been patient in '84 were running out of patience in '86. Foreclosure notices started appearing in the county legal paper, not one or two, but a steady stream. Farms that had been in families for generations were going to auction. Dale read those notices carefully. He wasn't a speculator. He didn't have capital sitting around. But he had something. He knew every piece of ground in the county because he'd been driving past it for 20 years. He knew which farms had good soil, which had drainage problems, which were priced as distressed sales, and which were being sold by banks that just wanted the number off their books. And he was cash flow positive. Barely, but genuinely. The bank, Fowler's Bank, had on its books 3 farms that were headed to auction in spring 1986. One of them was an 80-acre piece 3 miles south of Dale's home farm. Good ground. Dale knew it. He'd watched it for years. The previous owner had tiled it well, kept it clean, and then borrowed against it to buy more land somewhere else, and the whole thing had unraveled. The bank wanted $480 per acre. The ground had been appraised at $750 per acre in 1981. Dale went to see Fowler. He didn't go as a supplicant. He went as a buyer. He had his numbers, 3 years of cleaned-up cash flow statements, his debt schedule, his projected income including the hauling revenue. He asked about seller financing on the 80 acres. Fowler sat with the file. He'd been trying to move that property for 4 months. A bank holding foreclosed farmland is not a happy bank. The insurance, the taxes, the maintenance, the stigma. Banks don't want to be landlords. They want to be lenders. Dale walked out with an agreement to purchase 80 acres at $465 per acre. Seller financed at below market rates, with a balloon structure that gave him 6 years before a refinance event. He'd added 80 acres without a commercial loan. The neighbor who'd laughed at the truck, Gene Portis, found out about the purchase from someone at the implement dealer. He drove over, not hostile, just genuinely puzzled. "You bought ground," Gene said, "in this market." "Below replacement cost," Dale said, "with seller financing." "You're taking a hell of a risk." Dale thought about that. "I'm taking a calculated one." Here's the thing about the Gene Portises of the world. They weren't bad people and they weren't stupid people. They just evaluated risk from the outside. From the outside, buying farmland in 1986 looked like madness. From the inside, from inside Dale's cash flow statements, from inside the knowledge that he'd controlled his costs, that he had revenue from hauling, that the bank was motivated to deal, it looked like the only window that might ever open. Gene Portis had a bad harvest in 1986. He asked Dale in November if he'd haul some of his beans at the 10-cent rate. Dale said yes. By 1987, Dale had added a second piece of ground, 120 acres from another bank-owned property, this time negotiated with a different institution 30 miles away that had a portfolio problem and needed it solved. Same structure. Below market price, seller financed, long enough terms to survive. His total operation was now 680 acres. He'd started the decade at 480. Fowler's Bank, meanwhile, had a new problem. The bank had been part of a larger holding company that had overexposed itself to agricultural loans across 3 counties. Regulatory pressure was building. The holding company needed to demonstrate that its agricultural portfolio was stabilizing, which meant it needed performing loans, not more foreclosures. In the spring of 1987, Fowler called Dale, not to review his loan, to ask a question. The bank had taken back a 200-acre farm from a borrower who'd finally surrendered the deed. They needed an operator, someone to cash rent it and farm it competently while they found a buyer or decided what to do. Would Dale be interested? Dale thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to do the math in his head. He said he'd rent it at $95 per acre, below the going rate of 115s, but the bank was going to take $95 over zero and the uncertainty of finding someone else. He farmed those 200 acres on cash rent for 3 years, and when the bank finally decided to sell them, Dale was the first call Fowler made. This is where the story turns completely. The man who had sat in that office in December 1984, frozen lone on the table, trying to figure out how to survive a logistics crisis, that man was now the buyer the bank needed, not because of luck, not because prices recovered in some dramatic way. Corn prices in 1987 were actually lower in real terms than 1984, but because Dale had made a series of decisions that compounded over time. Fix the truck, control the hauling cost, turn the truck into income, stay cash positive, buy distressed ground when the bank needed a buyer more than he needed the ground, rent bank-owned land at below market rates during the crisis, negotiate from a position of demonstrated reliability. The bank that froze his loan in 1984 was now calling him to solve its problems. There's a photograph Dale kept on his office wall. Somebody took it in 1988. You can tell by the light, fall afternoon, harvest done. The 1963 Chevy is parked on the road at the edge of what used to be Harold Buss's farm, which Dale had by then purchased out of the second round of bank sales. The truck is still working, still running, still got the dent in the passenger door from the first winter haul when Dale clipped a culvert marker in the dark. It wasn't a trophy, it was a tool. But here's what it symbolized, and this is the thing that gets lost when people tell these stories as if they're about hard work and grit. They're not. They're about information and leverage. Dale understood that controlling his logistics meant controlling his cost structure. Controlling his cost structure meant staying solvent when everyone around him was going under. Staying solvent when everyone else was failing meant acquiring assets at prices that would never exist again. The truck was never about the truck. It was about understanding which costs you can control when everything else is out of your hands. It was about refusing to outsource the one variable in your business that directly determines whether you make money or lose it. The farmers who failed in the 1980s farm crisis weren't mostly bad farmers. A lot of them were excellent farmers with terrible logistics costs and no capacity to absorb shock. They thought scale would save them. It didn't. Scale without cost control just means you lose money faster on more acres. Dale Critton farmed until 2001 when he retired and sold to his son. The operation by then was over 900 acres, built almost entirely through distressed acquisitions during the crisis years, financed through seller deals and below-market bank sales. No dramatic expansion loans, no big gambles on equipment. Just a truck nobody wanted, repaired for $1,100 in the winter of 1985, that changed the entire cost structure of one farm during the worst agricultural crisis in 50 years. And Fowler? He retired from the bank in 1992. He and Dale ran into each other at a grain industry meeting a few years later. They shook hands, no drama in it. Fowler was a banker doing his job in a difficult time. Dale understood that. What Fowler had missed, what the bank had missed, was that the man sitting across the desk in 1984 wasn't looking for rescue. He was looking for time. He got it. He used it. If you know someone who made a decision like this, not the flashy decision, not the dramatic one, but the quiet structural one that everyone around them called stupid, leave it in the comments. These stories are worth keeping. And if you want more about the people who found leverage where nobody else was looking, subscribe. There are a lot more of them than history remembers.